Our chairman for this session raised a very profound question, which I've been thinking about these last few minutes. Was it chance or conspiracy that Sander Gilman was the last speaker? And I've come to the following conclusion. There was indeed a compelling logic to have Sander open this conference. And I did indeed consider it. And finally thought it was best to have him as the final speaker for two reasons. One of which he guessed, that there was a serious danger he might then go off shopping for the rest of the conference, and his presence has been indispensable through the course of these last 3 days. And he is, and I'd like to pay this tribute, in my view, the person who has thought the most deeply and over a long period of time about issues relating to hybridity, to difference, to cultural anti-Semitism, the kind of issues that indeed run through many of the themes of this conference. But there was another, even more compelling reason, much more compelling, why both Alvin Rosenfeld and Sander are in this final session. Because I think that in many ways, when it comes to the issues of anti-Semitism, of culture, literature, and ethnicity, both over the course of a long and very productive careers, have indeed contributed in such a way that they make my task easier in making these few reflections, and they will be brief. I have two tasks, in fact, right now. One is the more difficult one of trying to say something which has not been said, or in some way to try and extrapolate or distill a few of the incredibly varied analyses and insights that we've heard. And the second, much easier task and more pleasurable, is to thank all those people that need to be thanked. And that will come at the end. So first, a few reflections. By the way, on a personal note, before I begin that, this is the first time I've ever been described as an Austro-Hungarian remnant. Actually, I was trying to figure out, could this be a compliment? And it reminded me of a very profound statement by someone who definitely was an Austro-Hungarian remnant, one of the great novelists of the 20th century, Robert, who wrote one of the great novels of the last century, The Man Without Qualities. And there's a memorable passage early on in that novel where he talks about this state which no longer exists because it disappeared in 1918. And he called it by its initials, the K&K monarchy, the Kaiserliche und Königliche monarchy, Kakania. This was his homeland, Kakania, which has all kinds of connotations. And he asked himself the question, perhaps Kakania was a land of geniuses, and perhaps that was the reason for its demise. So this is what one Austro-Hungarian remnant had to say about the empire that disappeared, and perhaps it was a land of geniuses, and perhaps that was a compliment. Now, if I may try and address, in particular, some of the points, very stimulating points, which have been made in this last session. First of all, the issue has come up, to put it crudely, perhaps. It could have been the title of this conference, but I chose to discard it. Multiculturalism, good or bad for the Jews? I mean, that's one way if we chose to be reductionist, and I don't think we should be. But it's still a question. And it has come up. And the answer is not simple. Because multiculturalism, if I may speak personally for a moment, in many ways is a wonderful idea. I mean, I feel a multicultural person from as far back as I can remember. I was born in a Muslim republic in Asia, in Kazakhstan. I was born in a state that no longer exists, the Soviet Union. I still have a certificate of some Kazakh bureaucrat from southern Kazakhstan who wrote down in Russian the details of my birth. My parents were Polish, and that was my mother tongue. I lived in Poland and France before I came to Britain. I grew up in one of the most multicultural cities on the face of this planet, London. I grew up in a part of London, Golders Green, which could not be more multicultural, especially today. If you walk down the street, you'll see every color, every religion, every nationality that you could imagine. Orthodox Jews, Hindus, Pakistanis, Arabs, Irish, even a few English working class people. They're still there. A sort of diminishing, almost extinct species in some parts.
Tell about the house that you were bought, that you lived in UK.
No, I'll spare that. That's a Zionist detail. So yes, multiculturalism. Why not? And particularly for Jews, for all kinds of reasons that have come up in the course of these last 3 days. A polyglot people, a people that has a wider experience of living among a multiplicity of cultures than any other people on the face of this earth, by virtue of its diasporic history. And also that metaphor that I used in my opening address of the Tower of Babel, which in a way is a warning against the opposite of multiculturalism, the monoculture and the imperialist ambitions of unification, uniformity, and so on. Sander referred to hybridity, a very important concept. And indeed, it should not be overlooked that anti-Semites of all stripes have always seen in hybridity, whether it be of a racial or a cultural or religious kind, the enemy. And there are many examples of that, and this continues to be the case. The fear of miscegenation, the fear of métissage, the mixing of races and of cultures. Although race and culture are not identical, today, in today's discourse, they slide into one another, and in many ways, it is cultural difference that has come to replace that politically so incorrect term of racial difference. So yes, anti-Semites more naturally should be seen as the enemies of multiculturalism, and that might be a negative proof that multiculturalism is a good thing and Jews should go for it. And we heard a paper this afternoon about Australia, which might strengthen this hypothesis, that there are modes or forms of multiculturalism, while not providing a immunity against anti-Semitism or a guarantee for the preservation of Jewish identity, nevertheless appear to offer a better prospect, a better option than what went before. Because in those bad old days of a white Australia policy, Jews were not exactly welcome when it was particularly important in the 1930s and 40s in Australia. And the same could be said with even greater force about Canada, about which we do not have a lecture, although we touched on it last night, because Canada prides itself on being, and I say it again, the great multicultural success story. But Canada, in the days before multiculturalism, Canada had the worst record in the Western world when it came to admitting Jews who were fleeing Nazi persecution. In fact, there is a book about that very subject called One is Too Many, which None is Too Many, yes, which repeated the words of a Canadian immigration minister from that period regarding the Jews and why they should not be admitted to Canada. Mr. Blair?
Mr. Blair,
No relation to the British Prime Minister. Yeah, right. Nevertheless, many Canadian Jews that I have met would say that on balance, despite some problems, multiculturalism has been a good thing for the Jews of Canada, and perhaps only very recently there might be some rethinking of that. And if there is a rise in anti-Semitism, even in these English-speaking, impeccably rule-of-law democracies, even if there's a rise in anti-Semitism, I believe there is, it is not necessarily to be attributed to anything directly to do with multiculturalism. The United States, I did refer to in my opening lecture, but I think that the points made by Kenneth Jacobson in his absence, but ably read by his replacement, hold true for now. Obviously, there's no predictive value necessarily in American exceptionalism. But there are tensions, there's strains and stresses, and certainly they are felt in the Jewish unease in the United States, despite the strength of the Jewish position, with the multicultural situation. But in Europe, about which we have spoken at great length, the situation obviously is much more problematic. We heard about, early on, we heard about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We heard about Eastern Europe between the two world wars. We heard about Germany. And then coming into the more recent period, about the situation in countries like Holland and Italy, and then countries outside of Europe, such as Argentina. The Middle East is an entirely different matter. One might say that if there's perhaps too much multiculturalism for Jewish ease of mind in some parts of the Western world, there's either too little or no multiculturalism at all in the Arab and Muslim world. And and that seems highly improbable, if ever something of the original Western multicultural idea could be introduced into the Middle East, things indeed might improve for the better. But the very notion of cultural pluralism sounds like a non-starter at present. And that is one of the many problems that not only Jews, but the state of Israel has to face in this part of the world. We've talked about trends that are linked with these constituent parts of our conference. Globalization is one important trend. We didn't specifically discuss it as a separate topic, but it came up. It came up because in a globalizing universe, with the constant migration of groups from continent to continent, and in particular, the problem posed by non-integrated, non-Western, non-European minorities and those that have been influenced by a radical Islamist ideology or by Islam itself in the direction of non-integration, the problems that this is posing to Jewish communities in particular. But at the same time, it's no accident that I asked to this conference 3 Muslim speakers. Murad El-Hattab from France, Bassam Tibi from Germany, and Noni Darwish from the United States. Because I believe it is extremely important, and I'll repeat it once more for the last time, that we Jews, those of us particularly living in Israel, are aware that the voices that we hear today, in many ways frightening, dominant, clearly dominant, advocacy of violence, the claims for world hegemony, jihad, terrorism, and of course the anti-Semitism that has been amplified. These are not the only possibilities, and they are not views that are held by all Muslims. And it's important that we hear, and we have heard, very clear and, I would say, moving statements of not only of disassociation from that, but of a different vision, which could, in certain circumstances, change the face of our reality. I want to try and answer a question that was directed at me and other members of the panel. A very interesting question which I could suggest a number of possible answers to. It was to ask for the reasons, possible reasons, why cultural artifacts such as anti-Semitism could be so easily transferred from the Christian world, from the European context, into the Arab and Muslim sphere, despite the fact that some of the forms of anti-Semitism involved, particularly the deicide charge, the blood libel, and so on, are not obviously imminent to Islam. They are not part of its cultural world. And yet they have been so easily taken on, and they have assumed the dimensions, the almost staggering dimensions that we see today. A number of hypotheses that I would throw out by way of a spontaneous answer to that. Anti-Semitism, if you look at it through the ages, is not distinguished particularly by originality. What I mean is that anti-Semites often copy from one another. They pick up on an existing repertoire, one that's been developed over at least 2 millennia, if not more. The themes are standard. They are recombined in different generations and societies. Anti-Semitism is adaptable, it is changeable, it is, as Sander Gilman would say, protean, just as Jews themselves, certainly in the perception of anti-Semites and perhaps in reality, are also rather protean creatures. But the adaptability of anti-Semitism, and that's part of what we're talking about, should not disguise the fact that there is a certain constancy in the themes that have existed from antiquity to the present, and the accusations that have been made against Jews. The existence of this arsenal, of this repertoire, is, I think, one reason why it's inevitable that any group that is highly motivated for this or that reason, as many Muslims are today, to engage in the use of anti-Semitism will help themselves to the available repertoire, even if it doesn't come from their own cultural universe in the first instance. It's not difficult to adapt and to Islamicize because also in that culture there is a basis for doing it. But the heavy artillery comes from outside. And it's already been developed. So why not use it? It's there. As a British mountaineer said in 1924, before he died in a tragic accident on Mount Everest, he was about 200 meters short of being the first man to climb the highest mountain in the world. Before he went out on that expedition to the Himalayas, he was asked, but why do you want to climb Mount Everest? And his answer was, because it's there. And simple explanation though it may be, it's important. But there are other things. One of them, I think, came out strongly in last night's film. Think of some of those mass meetings with Muslims screaming in agreement and in unison, Allahu Akbar, and death to America, and death to Israel. And we've all seen those pictures. And we're all familiar with this phenomenon of mass mobilization as part of the politics of the 20th century. And the Muslim world is no different. And these are the methods of dictatorships, totalitarian systems and ideologies. And it seems to work time and again in a certain set of circumstances, particularly where democracy, civic society, and basic freedoms simply do not exist. And anti-Semitism has proved itself time and again to be an indispensable instrument of such mass mobilization. And then if you look at it from the standpoint of the rulers, it is a safety valve. Ask yourselves about the import of Western cultural artifacts into the Muslim world today. And ask yourself about the import of Western values. When President Bush announced his program for transforming the Middle East, and democracy was at the heart of it, it was very striking how many of America's would-be or so-called Western allies were alarmed. The last thing in the world they wanted to hear was that they should democratize their societies. Most of the good things that the Western world would have to offer to Muslims in the Middle East would in fact mean the demise tomorrow of virtually all its regimes. And therefore nobody who is in power could have any serious interest in implementing what will be the seeds of their own demise. However, there is at least one Western, highly developed Western export which is indispensable and which can indeed be permitted, and that is anti-Semitism, especially when it's allied with hatred of Israel, because that has been one of the great safety valves in the Arab world for decades. A classic function of anti-Semitism in many parts of the world and periods of history. How do you divert the discontent, the anger, the rage, the frustration of people with their own rulers? Anti-Semitism has been one of those instruments. And allied with a conflict, with the position that Israel has assumed as a result of relentless propaganda, and a real conflict that's still unresolved, the two combined means again that this particular import, I mean what is imported here are the specific things that we've been talking about, like the blood libel, the protocols of the elders of Zion, the kind of fascistic and Nazi-style anti-Semitism. those things can be permitted. You can have a demonstration tomorrow on the streets of any Arab capital without endangering the regime. Have them scream death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews. The regime is not going to be endangered. So this is democracy in action, Arab style. So I think that too plays a role. Now let me come to the pleasant and easy task. First of all, of thanking the members of my staff, who were rightly alluded to as a wonderful staff by Sander Gilman, Ruchama Roth, Sarah Goswald. I don't see all the younger members of the staff, but I just mentioned Abigail, Martina Weiss, Dina, who many of you were in direct correspondence with and did a wonderful job. Sandra said it was like walking across the street. I thought you were about to say it was like walking on water. But I think looking back, it was almost miraculous. And of course, reference was already made on the opening night to their well-deserved prizes. Outstanding group at the Hebrew University, and I think, and I hope that all participants have felt that they have been helpful in every way. Of course, the participants themselves, you are the ones that have made this conference what it is. Your contribution, the richness of the papers and of the discussions. And I'm very grateful to all of you for having come from so many far-flung corners of the world, sometimes arriving with a jet lag, but recovering in time to be able to make a contribution. I would like to say that I very much hope that all the papers that were presented here, that we will be able to have them from you by the 1st of October, if that's a reasonable expectation. I think it is. And that we will do everything in our power to make sure, through different options that we have for publishing them, to do so, because I think that would be a very important contribution. I would also like to thank those bodies that helped us financially and in other ways to put this together. Obviously, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the French Embassy, the European Forum, and the Anti-Defamation League. And finally, I'd like to thank all members of this audience and all the audiences who have asked intelligent questions, on the whole, made relevant comments, and have provided us with the indispensable interaction which makes such conferences an enriching experience. So thank you very much.